Members of the day, ordre du jour, private members' business, resuming consideration on motion 534 on child poverty, standing in the name of Ms. Sitsabaisan.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Trinity Spadina.
Thank you very much. Setting up and speaking to this bill is of extreme importance to those of us who represent urban areas and municipalities in large part because the need to deal with these issues defines the quality of life in our cities. And without a concerted effort on this, I think that what we end up with is a scattergun approach, which quite frankly leaves sector by sector in our cities in a great deal of trouble. For example, the issue of housing, which has been raised here several times. We know the housing agreements have been renewed across this country, but they are sustaining the status quo. And while they provide a dribble of new housing, in my city, perhaps 60 units of housing will arrive out of the renewed arrangements per year. 60 units of housing with a 92,000 person waiting list is effectively a 1,500-year waiting list. And without a new era of cooperation, without new programs to address poverty, to address the urban strategies and struggles that cities and towns have, quite frankly, across this country, we're in real significant trouble in Toronto. And it's one of the reasons why child poverty is growing at such an alarming rate, while the city takes its place as one of the wealthiest places in Canada, if not the world. In fact, the ranking of Canada as a safe place to live comes as cold comfort for those communities where housing conditions are so deplorable, access to social services like childcare and education are so limited, isolation due to poor transportation infrastructure is so profound that to call it one of the greatest places in the world to live leaves families and in particular young people gobsmacked. Something needs to change here. And what needs to change is not simply cutting taxes for people without incomes, providing income splitting and billions of dollars to affluent communities and affluent individuals as low-income communities struggle. What needs is a series of programs that actually delivers on the urban agenda. And as the urban affairs critic for this party, I've had the privilege of meeting with mayors across the country in the last 6 weeks, dozens of mayors. And contrary to what you hear from the government side, mayors across this country are asking for just this kind of legislation. They're asking for a return to the kind of advanced thinking that defined Paul Martin's tenure as Prime Minister, where the gas tax was created, where infrastructure funding was stepped up and committed to, where a housing program was put on the table, where even the plight of urban Aboriginals was part of a national dialogue to resolve issues rather than to simply believe that a tax cut could build a bridge or a tax reduction could get a subway delivered or a tax reduction was suddenly going to make daycare appear even if you had an extra $100 in your pocket. Something needs to change. And what this bill does is it highlights the areas that need to be focused on to build stronger communities right across Canada. The challenge I have with it is that someone who's sat on municipal council for 8 years and someone who has come to Ottawa to try to strengthen this partnership is that this is simply a plan to have a plan. And cities can't wait for thinking on this issue. They need action. And it's all well and fine to propose theoretical solutions and to aspire to strong language. What we need are strong programs and specific programs that fit directly into municipal budgets on an ongoing basis in a consistent way that deliver these programs, in particular on housing, of course on transit, but also in the management of water. One of the challenges municipalities are having right now is that climate change has happened. It's not a theoretical possibility. If you listen to Fox News, it's not even a reality. Sometimes you listen to the Conservative government, it's beyond their grasp as well. But climate change has happened. And climate change is doing extraordinary things to civic infrastructure and civil engineering. We had a flash storm in one part of Toronto while another part of Toronto was in sunshine that drove so much water into the sewer system, it blew a 40-foot by 100-foot 4.5-foot reinforced concrete cap on a sewage capacity holding bin at the waterfront 60 feet into the air and flooded the entire waterfront of Toronto. This was in downtown Toronto while Scarborough was in sunshine. And these sorts of things are not happening every 100 years as predicted by the insurance models or by civic engineering standards. They're happening once every 2 or 3 years, sometimes every 6 months in parts of this country. And if the government doesn't step up and address the infrastructure needs of Canada and assist cities on all the other fronts, including transit and housing, If the support isn't there and the partnership isn't built and the money isn't defined and delivered in a direct and predictable and a robust way, cities and municipalities will not have the capacity to deal with the fundamentals of urban living, which is the delivery of water and picking up of garbage. We need a comprehensive approach to municipalities. We need a comprehensive approach to dealing with poverty, and we need a comprehensive approach to setting the stage for a stronger relationship with this country. Infrastructure needs need to be led by housing. They need funding programs that directly deliver dollars to cities without complex subscription models and costly subscriptive programs that require pages and pages of applications to simply fund and get the state of good repair attended to and new housing units built. We need to make sure that co-ops in particular are protected, that their agreements are renewed with other affordable housing providers, the subsidies are sustained, and in fact we lean on the co-op model to deliver more capacity, not shrink our footprint in our federal program in that area. But we also need to pay attention to the social needs of cities as we build the physical infrastructure. And that's why things like daycare are so critical. Arts funding and recreational funding are also critical. And without a solid perspective and a platform on these issues, cities struggle. And so, you know, we have been critical of the Prime Minister this week, who has not met with the premiers, but we think that the Prime Minister of this country should also be sitting down on a regular basis with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities at their annual conference, but also should be pulling together the Big City Mayors Conference, which was a program initiated under Paul Martin to talk about where some of the significant economic challenges are emerging in large urban centres, where most of our immigrants settle, where most of the social problems are embedded in affluence and therefore not directly attacked under some of our national programs, but where the majority of Canadians live. We have the most urbanized country in the G7, and yet we're the only G7 country with urban strategies on some critical files. It's time for that to change. And as I said, as I've talked to mayors in Kitchener and Waterloo, as I've talked to mayors in Cambridge, I've talked to mayors in Burlington and Oakville, Regina, Calgary, Vancouver. They're meeting soon in Toronto to meet with the new mayor of this city, who I've also met with. And there is not a mayor amongst them that doesn't think that the federal government is stepping up and meeting its obligations. And in one of the critical areas, you can see it pronounced daily here in question period, is on the question of infrastructure. The funding is back-end loaded. Cape Breton and the City of Sydney have not had a penny from Ottawa in 2 years. They have no hopes of getting money this year, and the money they need for a $450 million infrastructure rebuild of their water plant is not even part of the 10-year capital program. In fact, if Sydney, Nova Scotia had to build that water plant itself, its annual budget is only $140 million. That's its annual tax draw. The project will cost $450 million to build to give clean water to people living in the regional municipality of Cape Breton. They would have to shut down their city for 3 years to build this by themselves. And the reason they need to rebuild this, federal standards changed in water supply. So the federal government is side-loading and down-loading and not meeting its responsibilities. Small towns and big cities are all falling behind on the infrastructure file, and when they do, the social dynamics and the social status of the lowest income Canadians are hurt the most. Housing, transit, social services are fundamental to the health of cities. They're as important as the roads and the bridges and the rail, and yet this government has walked away from all of those capacities and has not funded them properly, and the back-end loaded infrastructure program is a joke in city halls and town halls across Canada. There's not a mayor or town reeve or city councillor who doesn't understand that money's not coming for 10 years. That money was needed yesterday, it was needed last year, and instead what we get are $29 million worth of billboards, and quite frankly, sleeping under a billboard is not what I call a housing policy. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Parkdale High Park.
Here, here. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to be able to speak to the motion of my colleague from Scarborough Rouge River, and I want to thank her for all her work on eliminating child poverty, which is the subject of the motion we're dealing with today. And because this is the second hour of debate, I'd like to make reference to the actual content of the motion, and that is that the federal government should work in collaboration with the provinces, territories, and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities to eradicate child poverty in Canada by developing a national poverty reduction plan that includes A, making housing more affordable for lower-income Canadians, B, ensuring accessible and affordable childcare, C, addressing child nutrition, D, improving economic security of families, E, measures that specifically address the unique needs of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, and F, measurable targets and timelines. In other words, accountability. Mr. Speaker, it has been 25 years since Ed Broadbent's motion aimed at ending child poverty unanimously passed in this House, and yet successive Conservative and Liberal governments have failed to act on this promise. With almost 1 million children living in poverty, almost half of whom are Indigenous, surely it is time to end child poverty. Professor David Hulchanski, who is a constituent of mine, a professor in Toronto, has documented very precisely what is happening with the declining middle class and the growing polarization in our city, in Toronto. He calls it a three-city situation where some at the very top are getting more wealthy, an increasing shrinking group are staying about the same, but a growing number of people are falling further and further behind. Now, childhood poverty is costly, not only obviously for the children affected, costly in terms of their childhood experience of inequality, but also costly in terms of lost potential and social costs. I should point out Canada ranks 23rd among countries in the OECD, a shameful record. We want to set records, but not this one, surely. 1 out of 7 children in Canada lives in poverty, but if you are born Aboriginal, you have a 2 out of 5 chance of living in poverty. Shameful, shameful numbers. Now, UNICEF Canada has written a report, and they recommend creating a children's commissioner and making the UN Convention on Child Poverty enforceable in court. Now, Canada has ratified this international agreement in 1991, but progress remains very, very slow and very spotty. Now, this UNICEF report makes a number of recommendations, and they're worth noting. As I said, make the convention enforceable in courts, but also they recommend develop a national action plan aimed at bringing Canada into the UN Convention compliance. Hold a parliamentary review of the recommendations from the UN Committee on Child Rights and from the Senate report on children, and to include everyone under 18 under child protection legislation, and also to develop a program to educate children and others on the Convention rights. Now, I'd like to speak specifically to the sub-elements of this motion. First of all, dealing with affordable housing. Mr. Speaker, there is an alarming situation taking place now when it comes to the lack of affordable housing. There are 92,000 people in Toronto on the wait list for housing. In my community, in Parkdale High Park, we see families who have to make the gut-wrenching decision, do they pay their rent or put food on the table? They're going to keep a roof over their head, and therefore we have community kitchens and food banks bursting at the seams, a number of children who go to school hungry every day. This is shocking in a city as wealthy as Toronto. I see families with 2, sometimes 3 kids, and they're living in a 1-bedroom apartment because that's all they can afford. And I see people living in Toronto community housing, living in very substandard housing with serious maintenance problems, mold, water leakage, appliances that don't work. There are buildings in our community where the elevators don't work, Mr. Speaker. So we have serious problems, and also we have problems with a lack of effective rent control legislation where companies get around the legislation, they get people out of the buildings and jack up the rents, and the upshot is people can't afford to find a decent place to live, and there is an explosion of new homes being built, but they're mainly condos, private condos. Well, low-income people don't have the ability to buy these condos, and there's no affordable housing being built for them. Also, we have a problem with co-ops that are finishing their housing agreements and these are not going to be renewed. So we have people who are getting a subsidy, who were able to live in a decent place, a cooperative housing development, because they got a bit of a subsidy, and those subsidies will be lost. And that's a huge dilemma for many in the city of Toronto. Unfortunately, the Conservatives have abandoned their social housing responsibilities. 1 in 4 Canadian households, that's 1.5 million Canadians, families and individuals spend more than a third of their income on housing. And Canada is the only G8 country without a strategy on affordable housing. And of course, it was under the previous Liberal government where the National Housing Plan was abandoned. And it's shocking, Mr. Speaker, in a northern country with such high needs that we don't have effective housing or even a plan to get to that housing. Early childhood education, when it comes to public spending on childcare and early learning, Canada ranks last among developed and comparable countries. For years, Liberal and Conservative governments have ignored this pressing need for Canadian families. There are over 900,000 kids in need of care in Canada with no access to quality, affordable childcare spaces. The Conservatives promised 125,000 new spaces, but just like the Liberals, they didn't create one single space. And I know in my community, childcare spaces can run up to $2,000 per month per child, clearly far out of the reach of most families. But what noted economist Pierre Fortin has said that Quebec's model of childcare, affordable, accessible, high quality, has allowed more than 70,000 mothers to be able to join the workforce and generates a return of $1.75 for every dollar spent on childcare. Clearly an important investment. Well, when it comes to Indigenous children, they're the fastest growing demographic in our country, and investments made to reduce Indigenous child poverty would have huge benefits for Canada. We have alarming rates of poverty, huge housing problems. Even Mike Holmes is saying we have to build better quality houses for Indigenous communities. It would be a better investment, more cost effective. And of course, they also face huge food security issues, as far more so than people do in the South. Mr. Speaker, I remember noted Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, in answer to a question, what's the best thing Canada can do to create innovation, to boost our economy, to boost competitiveness and job creation? His answer, invest in children. Invest in childcare, invest in post-secondary education, invest in kids. That's your best bet for a strong, innovative economy. Mr. Speaker, we want the federal government to make the elimination of child poverty a priority. We need to develop an anti-poverty plan with timelines and measurable benchmarks that would include the key components of taking on the crisis of poverty for Indigenous children, making housing more affordable for lower-income Canadians, creating an early childhood and childcare education program, addressing childhood nutrition, and improving the overall economic security of Canada. We owe Canadians no less. It is our duty as parliamentarians to act. We should all be supporting this important motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And resuming debate, the honourable member for Yellowhead.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome this opportunity to participate in the debate on private member's motion M534, introduced by the honourable member of Scarborough-Rouge River. Her motion asks that the federal government work in collaboration with the provinces, territories, First Nations, Inuit and Métis communities to develop a national plan to eradicate child poverty in Canada. Mr. Speaker, as I am sure the member opposite is aware, there are already significant government measures in place that are helping to address poverty across this country. In fact, a recent UNICEF report backs up the action by this government, stating that child poverty has been reduced to an all-time low under this government. In fact, changes of our government made to Canada's social programs cushion many families and their children from falling into poverty during the global recession. That being said, our government doesn't think it's enough to simply help people keep their heads above water in tough times. the best strategies to address income equality and help people in low-income situations is to create more jobs and grow the economy. As demonstrated over the past 9 years, our long-term goal is and always has been to consistently improve economic conditions and in turn improve the quality of life for all Canadians all the time. Our government's pan-Canadian approach includes working with the provinces and territories to help Canadians get the skills and experience they need to find jobs and take advantage of the opportunities. Mr. Speaker, it goes without saying that to address such an issue as complex as poverty, all levels of government, as well as the community and not-for-profit organizations, need to work together. And in this matter, we have a great deal of success, Mr. Speaker. Take, for example, the yearly Canadian Social Transfer. Our government provides funding through the Canada Social Transfer, which provinces and territories may use to support poverty reduction initiatives. Funding for the Canada Social Transfer is an all-time high, over $12 billion in 2014-2015, an increase of $4 billion since our government took office in 2006. The Canadian Social Transfer also helps fund specific provinces and territorial programs targeted to families with young children and represents a federal commitment that will rise to $1.3 billion in the next fiscal year. This funding supports provincial initiatives in early child development, early learning, and child care and post-secondary education, as well as social assistance and other social services for families with children in low income. Furthermore, the National Child Benefit, also known as the NCB, is an example of federal, provincial, and territorial governments working in partnership to deliver benefits to families with children. The NCB has been enormously successful at delivering support for low-income Canadian families by reducing the number of families with children living in low-income situations. Our government continues to show that we've taken action to help those Canadians who need it most. Thanks to our government's stewardship of the NCB, the low-income rate for children was 1.8% lower in 2011, which is the most recent data we have. This represents 118,000 fewer children living in poverty than under the previous government. With all our benefits combined, our government provides over $15 billion a year in benefits for families with children. Even better, just last month, Prime Minister proposed new support measures to improve the lives of families and their children. Under these proposed changes, the Universal Child Care Benefit will be enhanced to provide $160 per month for each child under the age of 6 and $60 per month for children aged 6 to 17. This means parents will receive more than $1,900 annually for a child under the age of 6 and $720 for each child aged 6 to 17. Mr. Speaker, every single family with children under the age of 18 will benefit from these new benefits announced by the Prime Minister. These proposed changes also include the proposed family tax cut, a tax credit that will allow a spouse to transfer up to $50,000 of taxable income to a spouse in a lower tax bracket. It also includes the proposed increase of child care expense deductions, limits, and the doubling of children's fitness tax credit. As you can see, we are committed to helping families prosper and making life more affordable for all Canadian families. Of course, having proper shelter is also essential, Mr. Speaker. That is why, through the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, also known as CMHC, the government has invested more than $16.5 billion in housing since 2006. Working with its partners, CMHC has helped nearly 915,000 Canadian individuals and families find adequate and affordable housing. This will support new affordable housing and existing social housing needs. But let's not forget that there's also a great deal of work being done by the Department of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development. They fund a number of programs that seek to create safe and affordable housing to improve access to high-quality childcare, childhood nutrition, and the economic security of families and to meet the unique needs of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. In addition to the targeted support for those most in need, the government has also provided almost $160 billion in tax relief for Canadian families and individuals in the past 8 years. Mr. Speaker, we know that many Canadians still face a variety of financial challenges. The major government initiatives that I have just talked about will continue to help more and more people move up the income ladder. Our government has achieved tangible and measurable progress in the fight against poverty. More importantly, our support has changed the lives of Canadians for the better. Mr. Speaker, since 2006, there are 225,000 fewer children in poverty thanks to our government, and according to UNICEF's president, David Morley, it's pretty impressive. It's better than the majority of other countries did during the recession, and we will continue to do even more, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Reprise de débat.
Resuming debate.
Reprise de débat. La députée.
Resuming debate. The Honourable Member for Longueuil, Pierre Boucher. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I was just asking one of the pages to bring me a podium. I didn't know we were going to get started so soon. I would just like to remind remind you of what many of my colleagues have said so far. It's that we've been having this debate for 20 years in the House, and that members have already voted unanimously to adopt Ed Broadbent's initiative to eliminate child poverty, and that was in 1989. And we're having a debate today that is already that we've already had, and we already agree on the conclusions. And you know what? It's time to act. But I'd like to talk about my riding, which is in eastern Longueuil. Longueuil, for those who don't know it, is a city that has a reputation of being a comfortable suburb, but it's a reputation that hides deeply rooted poverty. Some of the nicer areas of Longueuil, like Le Parcours du Cerf, are neighbors of areas where the conditions for living are very different. Sacré-Cœur, Carillon, and Fatima. It's a Longueuil that you don't hear about very much. I've lived in Longueuil for over 14 years, and I know my city quite well, rather. I've spent the last 2 years since I was elected to this place to get to know parts of Longueuil that you don't hear about very often. Areas, neighborhoods where life is hard, where working long hours isn't always enough to pay for a quality of life, for quality housing, or to give children the food they need. Longueuil has people who live there who know very well homelessness, precarity, poverty. There are those who cannot read or write. There are housing units that are insufficient. And there are single-parent families who have to spend almost all of their income to pay for rent so they can have a roof. In Longueuil, many immigrant families are left to themselves in a country that they don't know. We also have areas where quality food is too expensive for too many people. This is maybe the hidden side of Longueuil, but it represents daily life for a huge number of men, women, and children. Roughly 37% of the young people in Longueuil are members of families that are under the poverty line. That's a very troubling number. And we're not talking about a one-industry city where the industry's gone. We're in a suburb on the south shore of Montreal. But what's particularly notable in Longueuil is the answer, the solution, its answer to the poverty. There is strong and exceptional solidarity there. There is a strong community network. It's the strongest, the biggest in the region, with an army of volunteers. This necessary infrastructure has been put in place. It's an infrastructure of people helping people. Quebec business people and builders are doing what they can to help their fellow citizens meet the daily challenges of healthcare, safety, and education. Table de vie in the area give future to our communities. We have food banks that are doing the impossible to meet the need in the community, and the need is growing. I've also had the privilege of contributing to certain initiatives with my team. These are touching and revealing experiences. If we look at the store L'Entraide Chez Nous, the construction of a collective garden in the Carillon neighborhood, the distribution of Christmas hampers with young people, and many more. Today's motion shows what role the federal government could play to ensure that these organisms are supported and not abandoned by governments when they do such essential work. This is work that contributes to social advancement, to improving economic conditions, and that, in so doing, benefit everyone. This motion shows that we want Canada to have a plan to reduce poverty. This would be a first step to meet the resolution from 20 years ago that was unanimously adopted by the members of this place. We're calling for an action plan to reduce poverty that takes into account the need for affordable housing for citizens with low income. We are calling for a look. We're calling on the federal government to bring people together and that it stops sitting on the sidelines, that it lead the fight against poverty in Canada and in Quebec, that it work cooperatively with Quebec and the other provinces, territories, and Aboriginal communities to come up with concrete solutions that will meet our international commitments, that will also allow us to meet our moral obligation to children and all citizens who are vulnerable. And I would add here that children are not a percentage of the population, they are 100% of our future. I was talking about some of the initiatives undertaken by organizations and citizens in Longueuil. These initiatives have one thing in common. It's that they invest most of their hope and their efforts into children and teenagers. A federal plan to fight poverty would be very good not only for individual citizens, but also for the community networks that are working to help in all areas affected by child poverty. A plan would help them. They know what's happening on the ground. They are the experts. They are the experts. In Longueuil, there we have the project Cultiver nos savoirs. It's a citizen-led project that has put in place a collective garden. It's something that brings together members of the community. It shows engagement community. This project is an initiative undertaken by Table de Vie de Quartier in Carillon-Saint-Pierre, and it shows to what extent they are a pillar in our community. Through these initiatives, from the community garden to the project of a mural to help with homework, the Table de Vie de Quartier make our neighborhoods really good places to live. There are other organizations like Le Fablier, which works with literacy and which gives mothers and families the means they need to learn. Other initiatives, the Maisonnette Berthelette, which despite huge challenges with funding, works hard year after year and puts together a program that allows children to get Christmas presents. This initiative helps 500 residents, including 300 children in Longueuil. Without Maisonnette Berthelette, these young people wouldn't have the happiness of getting a Christmas present. There's also the Isabelle Caron project, Semeur d'Étincelles, a fantastic idea which invites, which calls on high school students and helps them to stay in school so that they can fulfill their dreams. There's also the skating rink Bleu, Blanc, Rouge, which was put in place with the help of several foundations, including the Montreal Canadiens Foundation. And this is something that helps young people in the neighborhood get active and dream. Other organizations are working on infrastructure, which is needed for young people in precarious situations. There are exceptional organizations, pillars in their neighborhoods. For example, Maison Tremblay, for which I have been an ambassador. Maison de Jonathan, which is right next to my office. These are a couple of organizations that are making a huge difference. I'm talking about all of these groups, all of these people who are working hard, because it's important to understand that in Quebec, in Longueuil, people are working to fight poverty. For one generation at a time, one family at a time, one child at a time, we're putting the future back in the hands of these children, and we are working to attack poverty. By sending NDP members to Quebec, Quebec is signaling that this work is not done. There's a lot of work that is left to be done. The federal government has the responsibility to support these efforts, with all its might. It's important that young people know that they have a future and that we can do better. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Okanagan-Shuswap.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member from Scarborough Rouge River for her motion to reduce poverty in this country and welcome the opportunity to comment on the government's progress in this regard. On a national basis, we have had a great deal of success. The rate for children living in poverty was 18.4% in 1996. That rate dropped to just 8.5% in 2011. That translates into about 730,000 fewer children living in poverty at the end of the period than were living in poverty at the beginning. Unlike what happened in previous economic downturns, the low-income rate for children remained stable during the 2008 and 2009 global recession. The fact is, Canada's social programs cushioned the impact of the global recession and prevented many more Canadian families and their children from falling into poverty. Our government is taking a comprehensive approach to reducing poverty. It focuses on giving Canadians jobs and opportunities to achieve self-sufficiency while providing increasing targeted supports for those in need. Helping to level the playing field with lower-income Canadians and move more families and children out of poverty also includes direct support to families from the federal government. For example, we provide support through the Canada Child Tax Benefit, the National Child Benefit Supplement, the Universal Child Care Benefit, and the Child Tax Credit. Mr. Speaker, this year, the increase in the Universal Child Care Benefit will help families even more, and the program is even broadened to cover children from 7 to 17. In all, government provides over $15 billion per year in benefits for families and children. We also work closely with governments in the provinces and territories, as well as with Aboriginal organizations and voluntary group sector to reduce poverty. The annual Canada Social Transfer helps fund specific provincial and territorial programs targeted at families with young children and represents a federal commitment that will raise to $1.3 billion next fiscal year. The government is also helping families make better choices in the areas such as nutrition. For example, proper food and nutrition are essential to growing children no matter what their family income. Unfortunately, those living in lower incomes face particular challenges on that front. Through Health Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada, the government is spearheading several initiatives that improve nutrition and enhance food security for children. Child nutrition and food security is linked to a variety of factors, and meeting these challenges requires the contribution of multiple sectors working together. Our government is working with Aboriginal partners, provincial and territorial governments, and other sectors to look at how to best address these factors and provide Canadian families with the information and tools they need to make healthy choices. Mr. Speaker, having proper shelter is also essential. Through the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, also known as CMHC, the government has invested more than $16.5 billion in housing since 2006. Working with its partners, CMHC has helped nearly 915,000 Canadian individuals and families find adequate and affordable housing. Targeted groups includes low-income seniors, persons with disabilities, recent immigrants, and Aboriginal Canadians. Over the next 5 years, CMHC will invest a further $10 billion in making housing more affordable for all Canadians, particularly lower-income Canadians. This will support new affordable housing and existing social housing. There is also a great deal of work being done by the Department of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development. Mr. Speaker, I can recall when we first became government and our first minister addressed this with a $2 billion contribution to housing on reserve and off reserve, and especially in northern Aboriginal communities. They fund a number of programs that seek to create safe and affordable housing to improve access to high-quality childcare, childhood nutrition, and the economic security of families, and to meet the unique needs of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. But in addition to targeted support for these for those most in need, the government has also provided almost $160 billion in tax relief for Canadian families and individuals in the last 8 years. Canadians at all income levels have benefited, but the greatest benefit has been to low and middle income Canadians. Overall, Mr. Speaker, personal income taxes are now 10% lower, and more than 1 million low-income Canadians have been taken off the tax rolls altogether. Mr. Speaker, we know that many Canadians still face a variety of financial challenges. The major government initiatives I have just talked about will continue to help more and more people move up the income ladder. In that respect, we are doing a great deal better than all our major competitors in the G7 or the OECD. Since the 2008 global recession, we have created over 1 million new jobs. That is 675,000 more jobs than we had before the economic downturn started, and a vast majority of those new jobs, over 80%, of all jobs created have been in full-time positions, and over 65% are in high-wage industries. The fact is, we have weathered the global recession much better than most, and our economy continues to grow and provide good jobs for Canadians. Both the IMF and the OECD report that they expect Canada will have one of the strongest growing economies in the G7 this year and next. We will also have a balanced budget next year, Mr. Speaker, well before any of our trading partners, another sign that our economy is on the right track. Again, I would like to thank the honourable member for the motion. I hope that all members of this House will support it. I hope that all members will recognize the enormous strides that we have made in reducing poverty in this country and support our continuing efforts to do even more. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Reprise de débat.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Manicouagan. Mr. Speaker, obviously, when one starts off on the wrong foot in life, our childhood can be compromised, and this has to do with the underexploitation of individual potential. The motion to eliminate child poverty, despite its wording, has to do with elements of social vulnerability that are felt by those who have parental authority. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to talk about social statistics of 2013, stating that 2 out of 5 children in Native communities grow up in poverty. Now, there are some 15,000 Aboriginal citizens in my riding of Manicouagan out of 90,000 citizens. That's considerable. And there are communities that are remote, for example, Pakwashibi, and a number of these communities take 12 hours to get to by train, or by air. The air tickets are cost thousands of dollars. Now, in my own band council, the statistics that were brought to my attention showed that over 60% of the adult population in my community were dependent on the native social aid. So some 6 or 7 years ago, when I worked for the Band Council, over half of the population, of the working age population, were dependent on these income security and social assistance. Now, you might say, and you would be right, that there is a bit, the social aid amounts are higher in Native communities, Aboriginal communities, taking into account the cost of living on those reserves. Now, but the amounts are still insufficient to provide for a decent standard of living and to raise children. So beyond financial considerations, it is also important to examine how the parental model has gone astray within a number of communities that are affected by the degradation of our social fabric. Now, there has been a massive injection of funds in dysfunctional clan tribes, and this cannot be a solution to child poverty. And the Conservatives have indicated that their action plan, first and foremost, is based on hundreds of millions of dollars, they say, that were invested. But what I am saying here is that injecting funds is not necessarily the solution. It can be part of the solution, but it cannot respond to all problems that are present in socially dysfunctional communities. Now, when I talk about the absence of a parental model, or those who have parental authority, I am referring to speeches I have already made in this House with regard to street gangs, for example. Members of Parliament who have a good memory will recall that I said street gangs appear when children are not the object of parental authority and have to look after themselves. They get together, they take over an abandoned house, for example, and because the parents are not there, and they often decide to resort to crime in order to meet their needs. So we see houses with 15 children who are all underage, and it's a bit of a free-for-all. Now, that has to do with the fact that numerous parents or guardians are simply not there to provide supervision when social aid is paid. Not all, now I'm not talking about all families, these are isolated cases, but still they are, the fact is that some families receive their social aid payments, they become teenagers, they join their other colleagues who have received their social aid payments, and their children are simply left to fend for themselves. Unless there are older members of the family, for example, grandparents who decide to look after these children, but often these children are left to themselves. They turn to crime. That is sad, but that is what happens when you're 10 or 11 on reserve. Sometimes they simply turn to a crime because there is no parental oversight. Now, the principles of developmental psychology are based on long-term consequences from growing up in households without the necessary financial resources to meet needs. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm also going to talk about the insidious nature of being exposed on a daily basis to social dysfunction, for example, within a family. Even the children in my community, Mr. Speaker, who come from a functional family, who have enough money, who have educated parents, are, especially in remote communities where where the transportation costs are high, are exposed to deviant elements. I'm thinking of people, for example, who are highly criminalized, people who have been in prison many times, people who commit sexual abuse. Sometimes there are murderers who drive around our communities on bicycles, and there are people with HIV as well. People know who is who in a very small community, obviously. Some of our villages have only 1,000 people, so it's easy to figure out who is who. But people live outdoors in the summer, so children might see all kinds of behaviors. It is not rare to see an alcoholic who is sleeping on his 12-pack outside of its outside of a corner store with urine apparent on his pants, and there are ambulance workers who tell people who are sitting on the roof, they try to get them off. So children see all sorts of things. In fact, when I was a teenager, when we got our social aid payments, I invited my friends to see how things occurred. I told people to come and see how people behaved when they got their social aid checks. Ambulance drivers were there all day, and you'll be able to laugh at all these people. But today I see that that was wrong, and it was simply... I thought at the time that it was fun, and I actually almost gave tours to my friends who didn't live on reserves. There were people who had consumed PCP, so they were walking around naked. So the children were exposed to these all kinds of elements, and they didn't know what was normal. So when they are 12 or 13 or 14, especially for those who have never gone off the reserve, they think that the same thing happens across Canada, and that is not the case. There are communities that are dysfunctional across the country, but in the broader sense of the term, most of the Canadian population is functional, and there are not the kind of examples I talked about on the reserves. The environment and the people in a child's entourage have a great influence on the development of the child's brain. It has been proven that just a few years of poverty can cause lasting negative effects on a child development. Negative effects of poverty on a child from the prenatal phase to age 5 can be especially negative and persistent. So I'm talking obviously about the period before birth, fetal alcohol syndrome, and so forth. Obviously, the child will have a lesser quality of life. It's not a guarantee, but often when the mother abuses alcohol, it is clear that during pregnancy, it is true that the child will have more problems growing up. There is obviously a correlation, and that has been clearly proven. According to a social democratic perception, elimination of child poverty necessarily calls for the improvement of families' economic security by ensuring access to child care services, culturally adapted psychosocial services, and to affordable housing and nutritional food. I put a question today on concerning the Nutrition North program, but we have to think about culturally appropriate or adapted psychosocial services. Now, why am I talking about this, Mr. Speaker? Well, too often, caseworkers, social workers, and psychologists who are sent to our communities to meet pressing needs. Now, they may have been trained, they may have received a university training, but they may not be equipped to deal with the adversarial nature of the realities on Aboriginal reserves. When I said that on July 1st in one of these villages in my riding, these social workers will have a lot of work on the July 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. Some of these workers have been simply attacked because they tried to take their children away. And I saw this really, I actually saw someone be attacked with a can of Chef Boyardee. So this actually happens in our community. So social workers have to be well equipped and well trained because it is like throwing Christians to the lions. I humbly submit this, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
There being only 5 minutes remaining in the time provided for private members' business at this point in the day, we're going to go directly and invite the Honourable Member for Scarborough Rouge River for her right of reply. The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank all of my honourable colleagues in the House who have spoken to my motion to eliminate child poverty in Canada. And I also need to thank all of the local agencies and not-for-profit organizations, the advocates who are supporting this motion across this country. Thank you to my constituents of Scarborough Rouge River who have spent hours and days and weeks supporting my motion by making sure that we're increasing conversations in our community and signing our petitions and spreading the word amongst our community and neighborhood. There's been an umbrella organization called Campaign 2000 who, with their vibrant network of national, regional, and local partner organizations, have done so much work to get the word out about the motion to end child poverty in Canada. And I must say also a very special thank you to the campaign called Keep the Promise, because it is 25 years ago that we in this House, as members of Parliament, made a promise to end child poverty by the year 2000. And now 25 years has come and gone, and we haven't kept that promise. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to speak very quickly about reports that have come from the Conference Board of Canada. It says that Canada is 12th out of 17 compared to our peer countries with respect to income inequality. Income inequality in our country has grown over the last 20 years, and that the gap in between is what continues to grow. And since 1990, the richest group of Canadians continue to get richer, while the poorest group of Canadians continue to get poorer in our country, Mr. Speaker, and that is absolutely abhorrent and unfair, and it's not Canadian values. I hear a Conservative colleague saying that it's not true, but I'm citing a Conference Board of Canada report. Mr. Speaker, poverty today affects 3 million Canadians. That's children, seniors, Indigenous persons, people living with disabilities, single parents, recent immigrants. These are the groups of people who are more likely to be living in poverty. And today, 967,000 Canadian children are living in poverty. Canada ranks 15th out of 17 peer countries when it comes to child poverty. Once again, Mr. Speaker, I'm stating the Conference Board of Canada statistics. And it's imperative that we, as a have country, we're not a poor country, we are a have country, not a have-not country. It is imperative that we are investing in our children. I spoke about the motion in November 1989, that was brought forward by the then NDP leader Ed Broadbent to eliminate child poverty by the year 2000. In 1991, Canada ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which states that every child has the right to a decent standard of living, the right to clean water, nutritious food, clean environment, and good quality health care. For 25 years, successive Liberal and Conservative governments have ignored the problem or haven't done enough to actually alleviate the problem. And as a result, Mr. Speaker, today we have almost 1 million Canadian children living in poverty. In 1989, when this House made the promise to end child poverty, the LIM Act, I'm going to use this as my comparative, the low income measure after tax. So I'm comparing the same numbers in 1989 to now. Was 13%. The child poverty rate was 13% in 1989, and today it's sitting at 21%, Mr. Speaker. Sure, I've heard many members in this House saying that there have been many changes and improvements being made. Wonderful, but the problem is that there are far too many children who continue to live in poverty, and that is a serious concern. It's a serious concern that we as parliamentarians and legislators need to make sure that we are working towards the eradication of poverty in this country, especially amongst our children, because we have that responsibility to our children. We made a promise 25 years ago. We've been doing our best, is what I've heard, to keep that promise. So my question, my plead to my honourable colleagues in this House is that we haven't been doing enough. We need to do better. We need to be investing in affordable housing, accessible childcare, and child nutrition programs. Make sure that they are sensitive and sensible to our different First Nations communities and their cultural requirements. Make sure that we have measurable targets and timelines, and make sure that we actually act on it, because just making a promise isn't enough. But we do need to keep the promises that we do make. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Bravo, bravo. The time provided for debate has expired. Accordingly, the question is as follows. Ms. Tsitsabayasan, seconded by Ms. Sims, Newton North Delta, moved that, in the opinion of the House, the government should work in collaboration with the provinces, territories, and First Nations, Inuit and Métis communities to eradicate child poverty in Canada by developing a national poverty reduction plan that includes A. Le logement abordable.
A. Making housing more affordable for lower-income Canadians. B. Ensuring accessible and affordable childcare. C. Addressing childhood nutrition. D. Improving economic security of families. E. Measures that specifically address the unique needs of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities.
Measurable targets and timelines. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? Yes. All those in favor of the motion will please say yea. Yay. All those opposed will please say nay. No. In my opinion, the yeas have it. Pursuant to Standing Order 93. The recorded division stands deferred until Wednesday, February the 4th, 2015, immediately before the time provided for private members' business.